Imagine being locked away on a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by icy waters, guarded walls, and the weight of America's most notorious criminals. Life in Alcatraz prison was designed to be strict, cold, and unforgiving. Yet, there's one detail that might surprise you: or the food. Unlike the horror stories often told about prison meals, Alcatraz had a reputation for serving some of the best food in the entire federal prison system. Why? Because the government believed that well-fed inmates were less likely to cause trouble. Meals were hearty, balanced, and shockingly delicious. From roast pork with sage dressing to banana pudding with vanilla wafers, the menus read more like a small-town diner than a maximum security prison. Inmates ate cafeteria style in the mess hall, with choices of meats, vegetables, soups, breads, and desserts. And here's the twist: if you didn't like the food, you could simply go back for more. Yes, all you can eat was a real rule inside Alcatraz. So, what exactly did America's most feared criminals dine on day after day? Let's step inside the mess hall and uncover 12 surprisingly delicious foods served in Alcatraz prison. Split pea soup, the humble beginning of an Alcatraz meal. It might sound simple, but split pea soup was one of the most common starters in the Alcatraz mess hall. Served hot, thick, and filling, it was a perfect way to stretch ingredients and still deliver a meal that felt satisfying. For inmates who spent their days in cold, damp cell blocks, a steaming bowl of pea soup wasn't just food, it was warmth. The recipe was basic: dried peas simmered for hours until soft, mixed with onions, carrots, and sometimes small pieces of ham for extra flavor. Bread or rolls usually came alongside, turning the soup into something that could quiet hunger for hours. What makes this dish fascinating isn't the recipe itself, but the philosophy behind it. Alcatraz officials believed that food was one of the few comforts that could keep order in such a tense environment. Soup, cheap and easy to produce, was the backbone of many meals. Yet, it was also considered hearty and wholesome, packed with protein and fiber. For the inmates, pea soup was a taste of something familiar. Many had grown up eating it during hard times, whether on farms, in working-class kitchens, or in military rations. That connection to the outside world gave each spoonful a touch of home, even behind prison bars. And perhaps that was the secret: by offering meals that reminded inmates of family dinners or childhood kitchens, the prison quietly reduced unrest. A simple bowl of pea soup became more than food. It was discipline disguised as comfort. From here, the meals only get more surprising. Next up, a dish you'd never expect to see inside a maximum security prison: roast pork shoulder with sage dressing. Roast pork shoulder with sage dressing, a Sunday surprise in Alcatraz. When you imagine prison food, roast pork shoulder with sage dressing probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind. Yet, on special occasions, inmates at Alcatraz sat down to this very dish, and it quickly became one of the most memorable meals ever served on the island. The pork shoulder was slow roasted until tender, often basted to keep it juicy, and then paired with sage dressing, a savory bread-based stuffing flavored with herbs. This wasn't just survival food. It was the kind of dish that might have shown up on a holiday table back home. For prisoners living in one of the most feared penitentiaries in America, this taste of festivity carried deep meaning. Why would the government go to such lengths for inmates? The answer lies in strategy. Alcatraz was filled with men who had little left to lose. Keeping them fed with meals that felt generous was one way to keep tempers down and violence at bay. A holiday-style roast became less about generosity and more about maintaining order. For the prisoners, though, the effect was powerful. A bite of seasoned pork and herbed bread could instantly transport them out of the mess hall and into memories of family kitchens, Sunday dinners, or festive gatherings they once enjoyed. For a brief moment, Alcatraz didn't feel like a fortress of isolation, it felt like a place where humanity still existed. These rare meals proved something important. Even in a maximum security prison, food could serve as a bridge between harsh reality and fragile hope. And if roast pork shoulder seems surprising, wait until you see what came next: mashed potatoes and gravy, the comfort food king of Alcatraz. Mashed potatoes and gravy, the comfort food of Alcatraz. Few foods say comfort quite like mashed potatoes smothered in gravy. And yes, this home-style favorite was a regular item on the menu at Alcatraz prison. It might sound ordinary, but in the stark, stone walls of the Rock, mashed potatoes became one of the most beloved dishes among inmates. The potatoes were boiled, mashed, and whipped with milk and butter until smooth. On top, a ladle of brown gravy, sometimes made from pan drippings of roasted meats, other times a simple stock-based version, gave the meal a hearty finish. Alongside meatloaf, pork, or fried chops, these potatoes brought a familiar taste that reminded many inmates of family kitchens they hadn't seen in years. Why were mashed potatoes so important? Because texture and flavor mattered in prison life. Unlike watery soups or plain bread, mashed potatoes were filling, rich, and satisfying. They provided both physical comfort and emotional relief. Prisoners often said the mess hall food at Alcatraz was better than what they ate in other prisons, and potatoes with gravy were part of the reason why. There's also a practical side. Potatoes were cheap, easy to store in bulk, and quick to prepare for hundreds of men at once. For the cooks, they were a reliable staple. For the inmates, they were the closest thing to home cooking they could get. Imagine sitting in a noisy dining hall, surrounded by guards, yet digging into creamy mashed potatoes covered in steaming gravy. That small, familiar comfort softened the harsh reality of life on an island prison. But comfort didn't stop there, because right next to the potatoes came another side dish, one that carried its own nostalgic power: stewed corn and vegetables. Stewed corn and vegetables, a taste of everyday America. Vegetables may not sound exciting, but inside Alcatraz, they played an important role on the plate. Stewed corn, carrots, and other simple vegetables were common side dishes, offering both nutrition and a familiar taste of home cooking. For men living in a cold, grey fortress surrounded by water, even a spoonful of corn could bring back memories of farmland dinners, summer cookouts, or family suppers they once knew. The corn was usually canned, simmered with butter, salt, and sometimes a pinch of sugar to balance the flavor. Other vegetables, like peas or carrots, were cooked in the same fashion: soft, tender, and easy to serve in large batches. While critics today might call it overcooked, inmates at Alcatraz often welcomed the warmth and consistency of these dishes. What makes stewed corn fascinating is how it reflects mid-20th century American eating habits. Across the country, canned vegetables were a staple of kitchens, especially during the Great Depression and wartime. So when prisoners sat down to a scoop of stewed corn, it wasn't prison food, it was the food of everyday America. Psychologically, this mattered. Officials at Alcatraz knew that mealtime was one of the few times inmates could feel human again. Serving familiar vegetables helped reduce resentment and reminded prisoners of life beyond the cell blocks. It was a subtle way of keeping order through nostalgia. In the mess hall, stewed corn might have seemed like the least exciting part of the tray. But to men cut off from the outside world, even that small taste of golden kernels was a comforting reminder of normal life. And speaking of comfort, the best reminder of home came at the end of the meal: desserts like apple pie, baked fresh for Alcatraz prisoners. Apple pie, sweet comfort behind bars. Of all the food served at Alcatraz, few surprised inmates more than dessert. And nothing captured that shock quite like apple pie. Yes, inside the most feared prison in America, inmates were often treated to a slice of this all-American classic. The pies were made in bulk in the prison bakery, with simple ingredients, canned or fresh apples, sugar, cinnamon, and a flaky crust. Sometimes the apples were diced small, sometimes they were sliced, but the result was the same: warm, sweet, and familiar. For men who lived under constant surveillance and iron discipline, a bite of apple pie was more than just food. It was comfort. Apple pie has always carried a special meaning in American culture. It represents family gatherings, holiday meals, and the idea of home. Inside Alcatraz, that symbolism carried extra weight. Inmates who had been hardened by crime and punishment still felt the pull of memory when tasting a dessert they once shared with parents, spouses, or children. For a few moments, they weren't convicts on an isolated rock, they were simply Americans eating a piece of pie. But desserts at Alcatraz weren't just for comfort, they were a clever form of control. Well-fed inmates were less likely to riot, and a sweet treat could calm tensions after long days in confinement. Apple pie, therefore, wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. Still, for the prisoners, none of that mattered. All they knew was that the last bite of a meal ended with sugar, spice, and a reminder that even here, in one of the toughest prisons on Earth, humanity wasn't completely forgotten. And next, we move from sweet nostalgia to something far heartier: spaghetti with meat sauce, the Italian-American favorite of Alcatraz. Spaghetti with meat sauce, an Italian-American favorite on the rock. When you picture Alcatraz, you probably imagine cold cells, armed guards, and endless monotony. What you likely don't imagine is spaghetti with meat sauce, a dish more fitting for a family dinner than a maximum security prison. Yet, this Italian-American classic was a recurring favorite in the Alcatraz mess hall. The dish was hearty but straightforward: spaghetti boiled in massive pots, topped with a tomato-based meat sauce thickened with ground beef, onions, and spices. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. For many inmates, especially those of immigrant backgrounds, spaghetti carried a sense of tradition. It was a reminder of home-cooked meals shared around crowded tables in neighborhoods from New York to Chicago. What makes this meal fascinating is how it reflects the melting pot of American food culture. By the mid-20th century, Italian dishes like spaghetti had become mainstream across the country. Serving it inside Alcatraz wasn't just about variety, it was about giving inmates food that felt connected to everyday life outside the walls. For the men eating it, spaghetti night was a break from monotony. Instead of bland rations, they got a plate of pasta that could stick to the ribs. Some inmates even recalled it as one of the best meals on the island. Of course, there was strategy here too. A full stomach meant fewer fights, and a familiar favorite like spaghetti helped maintain peace in the dining hall. So while it may seem odd to imagine hardened criminals twirling pasta on their forks, that's exactly what happened. And for a moment, even Alcatraz felt almost normal. But spaghetti wasn't the only hearty staple. Up next is one of the most classic prison dishes ever served: meatloaf, the king of comfort food. Meatloaf, the classic prison staple. If there's one dish that screams mid-century America, it's meatloaf. And for the inmates of Alcatraz, this humble meal became one of the most recognizable staples on their trays. Simple, hearty, and easy to prepare in bulk, meatloaf was a cornerstone of prison dining across the country, and on the rock, it was no different. The recipe was basic but satisfying: ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, eggs, and seasonings, shaped into a loaf and baked until firm. A glaze of ketchup or brown sauce sometimes coated the top, giving it a touch of sweetness. Served alongside mashed potatoes, vegetables, and bread, it created a balanced meal that filled stomachs quickly. But beyond nutrition, meatloaf carried a kind of cultural weight. It was the kind of dish men grew up eating at kitchen tables during the Great Depression and World War II. Many inmates could remember mothers or wives stretching a pound of meat into a whole dinner by padding it with bread crumbs, making meatloaf not just a meal, but a symbol of survival. Inside Alcatraz, that memory mattered. The prison's philosophy was that well-fed men were calmer men. Meatloaf provided comfort and familiarity in an otherwise alien environment of steel bars and armed guards. It was a dish that grounded inmates in something ordinary when everything else around them was extraordinary. To the guards, it was just another efficient meal. But to prisoners, each slice of meatloaf was more than calories, it was a connection to a life they once had. And while meatloaf was a regular staple, sometimes the menu took an even richer turn. Coming up, fried pork chops, a surprisingly indulgent option behind bars. Fried pork chops, indulgence behind bars. When you think of maximum security prison food, indulgence isn't the first word that comes to mind. Yet, Alcatraz surprised inmates with dishes like fried pork chops, crispy on the outside, tender on the inside, and perfectly seasoned. For men trapped on an island surrounded by cold, unforgiving waters, a plate of fried pork chops was more than a meal, it was a small luxury. The preparation was simple but effective. Pork chops were seasoned, sometimes lightly breaded, then fried until golden brown. They were usually served alongside mashed potatoes, vegetables, and gravy, creating a hearty, satisfying dinner. For many prisoners, this dish became a highlight of the week, a taste of something that felt indulgent in a place built for austerity. The surprising thing about fried pork chops in Alcatraz wasn't just the flavor, it was the philosophy behind it. Prison officials believed that well-fed inmates were more manageable. Meals that reminded men of home or special dinners helped reduce tension in the mess hall. A crispy pork chop wasn't a treat, it was a calculated tool of control. For the prisoners themselves, the memory of biting into a perfectly cooked chop often lingered long after the meal. It reminded them of family gatherings, Sunday lunches, or kitchens from childhood. Even the most hardened criminals found a sense of normalcy in that simple, savory taste. And while pork chops were rich and satisfying, the prison also offered simpler, fast food-style options. Up next, hot dogs and chili dogs, quick, filling, and surprisingly popular among Alcatraz inmates. Banana pudding, a creamy dessert behind bars. While Alcatraz was known for its strict rules and rigid daily routines, the mess hall occasionally offered inmates a treat that felt downright luxurious: banana pudding. Soft, sweet, and creamy, this dessert brought a touch of indulgence to life on the island. The pudding was simple yet satisfying. Layers of vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and rich custard were assembled in large trays, often topped with whipped cream or meringue. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a comforting combination of textures and flavors that reminded prisoners of home, family kitchens, and simpler times. For men locked away far from loved ones, a scoop of banana pudding offered a momentary escape. Banana pudding also reflects a broader trend in American cooking of the mid-20th century. Custard-based desserts were affordable, easy to make in bulk, and popular in both homes and institutions. Alcatraz leveraged that tradition to provide inmates with something familiar yet comforting, proving that even in the harshest conditions, food could maintain a connection to everyday life. For the prisoners, dessert wasn't just about taste. It was a morale booster, a small reminder that not every aspect of life on the rock was bleak. A spoonful of banana pudding could soften the monotony of prison life, even if only for a few minutes. And while banana pudding satisfied the sweet tooth, breakfast and lighter meals still offered comforting staples. Next up, biscuits and gravy, a hearty morning classic that warmed prisoners from the inside out. Biscuits and gravy, the hearty breakfast of Alcatraz. Breakfast at Alcatraz wasn't just about starting the day, it was about fueling hundreds of men for long hours of labor and strict routines. One standout dish was biscuits and gravy, a hearty classic that brought warmth and comfort to the early morning mess hall. The biscuits were freshly baked in the prison bakery, golden and flaky, and paired with a creamy sausage gravy made from pan drippings, milk, and seasoned flour. The combination was rich, filling, and satisfying, providing both protein and carbohydrates to help inmates power through the day. For many prisoners, biscuits and gravy were the kind of meal that reminded them of family kitchens back home, stretching back to childhood breakfasts in small-town America. What makes this dish particularly memorable is its dual purpose: it was both comfort food and a practical meal. Sausage gravy was inexpensive and easy to prepare in bulk, while biscuits could be baked daily in large quantities. Together, they created a meal that was efficient for the kitchen staff but deeply satisfying for the men eating it. Beyond nutrition, biscuits and gravy held an emotional significance. Life in Alcatraz was isolating and tense, but a warm plate in front of a prisoner could be a brief reprieve, a reminder that simple pleasures still existed, even inside a maximum security prison. In a place where every day was regimented and strict, this breakfast offered a rare moment of comfort and familiarity. And while it fueled the men for work, it also connected them to ordinary life outside the island. For the grand finale of our Alcatraz food journey, we return to the simplest yet most consistent part of every meal: soup and bread, the classic combination that anchored nearly every tray. Soup and bread, the everyday anchor of Alcatraz meals. If there was one food combination that defined life in the Alcatraz mess hall, it was soup and bread. Nearly every meal on the island included some form of this simple pairing, and while it might not sound extraordinary, it was the steady rhythm of prison dining. The soups varied from day to day: split pea, vegetable, bean, or sometimes just a thin broth with bits of meat or pasta. They were cooked in huge vats, seasoned enough to be palatable, and served steaming hot. Bread rolls, baked fresh in the prison's own bakery, accompanied the soup. These rolls were soft inside, with a slightly crusty exterior, and they gave prisoners a reliable way to fill up when the rest of the tray felt light. What made soup and bread so essential was their balance of practicality and comfort. Soups were cheap, easy to prepare in bulk, and a perfect way to stretch ingredients. Bread was equally economical, but also comforting, something almost every prisoner would have eaten regularly before incarceration. Together, they created a sense of normalcy that softened the harshness of prison life. For the men of Alcatraz, this pairing wasn't just nourishment. It was routine. In a world of strict schedules and isolation, soup and bread became a constant, a reminder that even in confinement, certain rituals of daily life remained unchanged. And perhaps that's the lasting story of Alcatraz food: meals weren't gourmet, but they were surprisingly hearty, familiar, and humane. Even in the most notorious prison in America, food served as both a survival tool and a quiet connection to the outside world. Food at Alcatraz wasn't just about feeding prisoners, it was about control, order, and, in rare cases, comfort. From hearty breakfasts to unexpected treats like ice cream, every dish carried a story of survival behind bars. These meals remind us that even on the rock, humanity found its way onto the plate. If you enjoyed uncovering the forgotten flavors of Alcatraz, make sure to subscribe for more hidden food histories and nostalgic stories from America's past. And tell me, if you had to choose one dish from this menu, which one would you actually try? Drop your pick in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring the past, one bite at a time.